Well, I promised some wild things. Let's just jump into this third session. And we're going to talk about microcodes and metacodes. And we'll touch on extraterrestrial sources, and we'll finish with the ultimate code. So there is an area of cryptology that we haven't talked about. I won't go into it lengthily just to make you aware of it. And that's, it's sort of a field of cryptology. And that's where you're trying to find the language of a lost culture. And the Rosetta Stone being a classic example, which tied together hieroglyphics, Demotic and Greek, and trying to decipher hieroglyphics is this kind of pursuit. And also the Cliff of Behistun is another example. It's sort of a Rosetta Stone kind of thing on the famous Cliff of Behistun, which also tied together a number of the ancient languages. And so these are exciting things. If you're interested in this, I encourage you to get the literature. Some great adventurers with great minds unraveled this in the past. But the area that intrigues me particularly, and I think many of us, is this whole area of extraterrestrial communication. It may surprise you to discover that that is a field of science, a field of inquiry. And the whole idea now, Project Osmo is one of these attempts to search for outer space. Are there civilizations out there? The one that intrigued me the most is SETI, Communication for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. There was a conference in 1971 with the National Academy of Sciences. And they met 81 of the top scientists in Boca Raton in Russia. And what was interesting about this very closed group where they explored the communication of extraterrestrial intelligence, and they're still doing other ones with SETI and so forth. You probably heard about it. But they used the Green Bank formula. What they did was that this was the format for the conference. And in trying to estimate the number of civilizations in our galaxy that might exist, they took the rate of star formation, which is one field of science. The fraction of those that might have planetary systems is another area of inquiry. And of those, which planets might have a life-capable ecology, and that is a whole other set of scientific speculations. Then the fraction of those on which life actually occurs, and the fraction of those in which intelligence beings might develop to achieve a communication phase, and then of course the mean lifetime of these things. Well, anyway, by formatting the conference this way, they had experts from all fields of science, and while they were focusing on trying to estimate the possibility of life in outer space, they inadvertently were evaluating this whole hypothesis of evolution. And what's interesting about the conference, the proceedings are available in the technical journals published by the MIT people. The translations? It's interesting that they come up very pessimistically because they finally acknowledge that the conditions are so rare, so unique. It makes the very advent of life virtually a miracle. But it was strange to hear these scientists inadvertently come to that conclusion, so to speak, through the back door, and rather provocative. But this whole area of extraterrestrial languages is an interesting. There have been a number of, and I won't go through these academically. We've got more important things to talk about. But there are a number of studies that have tried to figure out what are the requirements to create a language if you did encounter some kind of extraterrestrial intelligence, and of course, these have also, not only, they're serious scientific inquiry, but they also generate novels and other things that we've run into. But you may recall on Phoenix 10, they had a plaque, which was designed, hopefully, to communicate to whoever might find it out there that there's life. They had the silhouettes, they had the binary equivalent of various decimal figures, they had a model of the solar system, and things that would cause anyone finding this to infer that it came from people who knew something about the solar system. Well, who knows? But this whole area of a language, how would you recognize a language that was designed for extraterrestrial communication? It's an interesting problem, and there's serious people who have been playing around with this. What would be the characteristics of such a language? Would it be phonetic? Hardly, because we don't know if they even have audible communication. Pictorial is a possibility, or would it be conceptual some way? How would it be self-parsing? If you have a stream of this language, how would you indicate the ends of words or sentences and things? And how would you use redundancy versus bandwidth? You try to compress as much information as you can in the bandwidth available, on the one hand. At the same time, you need some redundancy to allow for errors and things, so there's a trade-off there. Well, let me explain a little bit about redundancy. These letters that I put up here, I'm going to use them two ways. These letters, if I add on the screen a few other letters, a blessed friend brought breath and ease again. That makes sense. I can take the same basic letters and just change a few. I'll say the same root letters, and I could say a cursed fiend wrought death, disease, and pain. In other words, only a few letters in that sentence carry the real meaning. The rest of those letters on the screen are really redundant. See, English, for example, is about 75% redundant. Now I'm speaking in terms of the unnecessary letters. I'm not talking about being laid off. I understand the word redundant here in Britain has a little different connotation. Redundancy in language improves the signal-to-noise ratio if you add adverse jamming on the one hand. On the other hand, it uses up bandwidth. Cryptanalysis, of course, it depends on redundancy. One of the ways you can compress languages is to drop the vowels. You'll discover that in manual cryptography, you generally drop the vowels and communicate just the consonants, and that's adequate, and it makes the code much harder to break. Vowels are generally also redundant. There's a few exceptions. And so with that little sort of perspective, we're going to explore a language that's dear to us for some other reasons and discover that it has characteristics that are absolutely unique on the planet Earth, and that's Hebrew. It's interesting that in Genesis chapter 11, verse 1, it says the whole earth was of one language and one speech. So all language on the earth derived in Genesis 11 from a single language. And there are many scholars that suspect, I wouldn't say they can prove it, but they suspect that that original language was in fact Hebrew. But let's move on. I'll remind you that this rabbinical proverb is that we really won't understand the scriptures until the Messiah comes, and when he comes, he will not only interpret the passages, the words, the very letters, and even the spaces between the letters. So we're going to start looking at what I call microcodes, the small part. I mentioned before that Matthew 15, 17, 18 enforces this, where Jesus himself says, "Think not that I've come to destroy the Torah or the prophets. I come not to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled." Well, the Hebrew language. It's interesting that there are languages that have pictorial ideograms, sememes, as well as phonemes. Most of us think of sound. Most alphabets are phonetic, and they deal with phonemes. But it's amazing to discover that the Hebrew language isn't just phonetic. The letters themselves intrinsically carry meaning. Let me give you some examples. The first letter in the Hebrew alphabet is the Aleph. The University of Arizona has pointed out to me that if they can teach the kids how Hebrew was written before the Babylonian captivity, which was written in a different style, a more pictorial style, if you learn Hebrew the way it was written before the Babylonian captivity and can translate that to how it's written today, you can do this probably in an hour, then you can read about 80% of Hebrew. And that's a shock. Let me give you an example of what they're talking about. The Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, that's where we get alphabet, by the way. That's a Hebrew word, incidentally. But the Aleph was originally written, as you see it on the left on the screen, sort of like a long-horned steer. It represented an ox. So the Aleph is the first letter, so it also represents first. But because it's the ox, it also suggests strength or the leader, is what it's the conceptual the conception that the letter conveys. The second letter in the Hebrew alphabet is the bet, and it is written on the right. You see the way it's written today. That's since Babylon. But in the early days, it was just written like a little line with a teepee on it, or a tent. It's a house. That bet turns through the centuries to become RB, if you will. But the Beth means house or family. That's where we get Bethlehem, the house of bread, or Bethel, the house of God, if you will. And so the bet. Now, what's interesting, if you take the Aleph and the bet together, you get the leader of the house. Remember, of course, it goes from right to left, backwards from our point of view. See, an Aleph and a Beth is the leader of the house. Who's the leader of the house? Father. This is the word for father. Abba, father. Abba's daddy, but father. It's interesting, what I'm trying to get across is the letters not only are phonetic, the letters themselves carry meaning, and that's distinctive, that's unique. And let me give you another example. There's another letter called a he. It's just a breath. And it originally may have represented like a hands lifted up or an open window. Well, it's all speculation, but it's a he, it's a breath. And it means either behold or revealed, or also means wind or spirit. When you put a he in the middle of a word, it typically represents the essence of whatever that word meant otherwise. And so if you take the aleph and the bet and put a he in the middle of it, the aleph and the bet was the Father. The he means the essence of the Father. And that, of course, is the word for love. Aha. And it's in other words, the essence of our Father is love. You begin to see how the letters themselves start to unfold the meaning, not just the pronunciation of the word. Now, you may recall in Genesis 17 that Abram and Sarai had their names changed. And all that's changed is a he is placed in them, which of course is the breath of the Holy Spirit. And so Abraham becomes Abraham, and Sarah has the H on it. Now, the other thing about Hebrew that's provocative from a scientific point of view, there are 5 letters in their 22-letter alphabet. There's 5 additional letters that are different if they are the last letter of the word. They're written differently, which, and realize the ancient language, they call it scriptura continua, they didn't have spaces between the words. If you read the ancient languages, they're typically a stream of letters. And one of your problems is how do you parse it? You do it just by inference in most cases, but in the Hebrew it's self-parsing. So if some imaginary foreigner received Hebrew but had adequate computer skills, they would find the language would ultimately be self-parsing. Now, so the Hebrew language is ideograms and phonemes together. It's self-parsing. The vowels are inferred. The Hebrews, the vowels are inferred. The modern Hebrew has little marks above and below the letters, which are clues as to how it's pronounced. But originally that wasn't that way. They were just inferred. Hebrew language maximizes the available bandwidth. One of the things you'll notice if you pick up an interlinear, where it has Hebrew with the translation, you'll see just a few Hebrew letters and whole words or phrases in the English. It's much, much more compressed, and it maximizes the available bandwidth. So, interestingly enough, if I look at the languages available on planet Earth, the one that lends itself most suitably to the kind of interterrestrial kind of things we're talking about, Hebrew would be the choice. But one of the other things that comes up as you start talking about these things is the Bible inerrant. You know, we're taught that. We know that from being properly taught, and yet many people have a real problem with that. I can remember when I was in high school, I had a friend who was the son of a Unitarian minister, so he knew his Bible, but they didn't take it seriously like us fundamentalists did. He used to kid me all the time. He says, "Chuck, you believe the Bible's inerrant, don't you?" Well, yeah, that's what I was taught. He says, "Well, what about 1 Kings 7:23?" And of course, in 1 Kings 7:23, we have an interesting description of an object. This is where Solomon is preparing his temple, and in the temple there is this, what the King James calls the molten sea. Molten means it's cast, and the sea, it's a laver. It's a huge wash bowl that the priests would do their ceremonial bathing in. And it is said to be 10 cubits in diameter and 5 cubits deep. A cubit, we'll assume here for convenience purposes, about an 18-inch dimension from the elbow to the fingertip. And so the problem is that it's described as 10 cubits in diameter and 30 cubits in circumference. And everyone knows that, every school kid knows that the circumference of a circle is not 3 times the diameter. There's a strange number called pi, which most of us in school probably approximated with the fraction 22/7 or 3 1/7. But in the engineering department, they probably say 3.14159 or more. And that's been calculated into hundreds and hundreds of decimal places for various reasons. But the value of pi, this peculiar odd number, it's one of the constants of the universe. And here apparently is an error because this thing is described in terms that are mathematically unsound. And I remember being confronted with this, and I didn't have an answer in high school. I just took it on faith, if I can put it that way, figuring the day would come when somehow that would unravel. Well, And some people, by the way, do try to make an argument that there's a handbreadth thickness of the thing, and if you take use the handbreadth and you take one measure from the inside and the other from the outside, you can sort of get around this, but it really never was convincing to me. But I had a rabbi explain something to me. Here is the passage as it's translated in the English, and he made a molten sea, 10 cubits from one brim to the other, and it was round all about, and its height was 5 cubits, and a line of 30 cubits did compass it round about. In the Hebrew, as you see below this, remember it goes from right to left, when you get to the word for circumference, it turns out to be misspelled. Now the Masoretes, when they found something like that, they didn't correct it, they marked it and put what is the correct version in the margin. The error, apparent error, was called a kathif, and the marginal correction was called a kiri. And there is one of these on this passage in 1 Kings 7:23. Well, it turns out, of course, as you probably know, there's 2 languages on the planet Earth that have a strange characteristic. The letters also have numerical values. Hebrew is that way, and also Greek is that way, and we're going to exploit both of those before we're through in this session. But every letter in the Hebrew has a numerical value. The aleph is 1, the beth is 2, and so forth, and the larger ones have larger values. The final forms of the last, there's actually 22 letters plus 5 final forms. There's a total of 27 altogether. But the point is, if you look at the kathif, it is misspelled. You see, the proper way to spell this word for circumference is a kaf and a vav. But in the text here, it happens to have a he at the end, a breath. Not a big deal, but strange. Well, the kaf has a value of 100, the vav a 6, and the he a 5. The kiri has a value, thus, of 100 plus 6, or 106. But the way it's spelled in the text is has a value of 111. Well, when you apply that to the thing, it turns out that you take this 46-foot circumference, and it's specified to an accuracy with an error less than 15 thousandths of an inch, if you understand the Hebrew structure here. And that was startling to me. I thought that was rather fascinating. And so there, in the original text, it has an amendment here that's relevant, and you find more and more of those. I didn't put it in the slides because it gets too complicated, but I'll just throw it out verbally here. There is a formula for the new moon that was kept secret among the rabbis until relatively recent years. But applying that encrypted algorithm for the new moon, see, the problem with the new moons is that it's what in computers they call a 3-body problem, because it affects the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon to calculate. It's very complicated, but the precision of the Hebrew, it rivals our satellite data today, by the way they do that. So it's amazing some of the things are tucked away. But David Roosevelt highlighted something to me that I thought I'd throw in here. If you take Genesis 1:1, and you take the number of letters times the product of the letters and divide that by the number of words in the product of words, you get the value of pi to 4 decimal places. Well, that's kind of curious. But if you go to John 1:1 and do the same thing, you take the number of letters times the product of letters and the number of words times the product of the words, you get a different number that is the Euler, the E, that comes up in advanced mathematics. The E and the pi are the 2 basic constants of the universe, and it's startling to find those apparently embodied in the first verse of Genesis 1 and the first verse of the Gospel of John, both of which talk about the creation of the world. So that's kind of fun. But isn't the Bible fun? More stuff. It's inexhaustible, which is what you'd expect it if it's the Word of God. Let's shift to another thing. I like to deal with some of these translational problems. Most of you are familiar with Zechariah 12:10. It's an Old Testament allusion to the second coming of Jesus Christ. It says, I will pour up on the house of David, upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the spirit of grace and of supplications, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced. And it goes on. This phrase, they shall look upon me whom they pierced, is one of the several reasons we feel that Jesus Christ, when he does appear, will still be bearing the scars. The only man-made things in heaven will be scars. But there's something about the translation here that I think is worth mentioning, I find interesting. If you look at this in the Hebrew, you'll discover that if you see it interlinear, every word has got part of the English translation, except there's 2 letters that are not translated. and an aleph and a tau. Now, the aleph and the tau are often used as a grammatical device to indicate a direct object, but it has some other uses also. When it's used as a grammatical device, it has a makef, a little hook to the word that's directing. Here, though, it says, "They shall look upon me," and then there's an aleph and a tau, untranslated, "whom they have pierced." Well, as I said, the aleph and the tau can be a grammatical element, but then it usually has a makef. It can be used as a pronoun to indicate the second person masculine singular. And it also can be an indefinite pronoun. But this may be what's called a hypokatastasis, which is a Greek term meaning putting down underneath. There are figures of speech in the Bible, allegories, types, similes, metaphors. How many different kinds of parts of speech do you think are in the Bible? Make a guess. Over 200, and they're cataloged as an appendix in our book. But hypokatastasis is one of them, and this could very well be. You see, that's a hidden but declarative implied metaphor expressing a superlative degree of resemblance. The aleph and the tau that make up this puzzling little drifter, this little word, the aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the tau is the last. If I said this in the Greek, "They shall look upon me, the Alpha and the Omega, whom they've pierced." But it's in Hebrew. "They shall look upon me, the aleph and the tau, whom they've pierced." You get the point I'm trying to make? The same thing occurs in Genesis 1:1. We never see this translated. The argument is, well, it's really there for grammatical purposes. Maybe, maybe not. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. In the beginning, created God the heaven and the earth. But here again, we've got this little floater that is untranslated. In the beginning, God, the Alpha and the Omega, using the Greek idiom they're more familiar with, created the heaven and the earth. In the beginning, God, the Aleph and the Tau, created. Jesus Christ is the creator of the world. That's what John opens his gospel with, the 3 verses that make up the genealogy of the pre-existent one, and that's what Paul confirms in Colossians. Without him was not anything made that was made. Without him, all things are held together. This little floater, I'll call it, occurs 7 times in Genesis chapter 1. And so it's a point of debate among scholars, but I think it's something that is interesting. Again, the New Testament is in the Old Testament concealed, the Old Testament is the New Testament revealed. Let's talk about another thing. We talked earlier about authentication. One of the uses of secret codes isn't just to convey information. Another use of them is to authenticate a message. If you're, say, an undercover operative in a foreign country and you're starting to see all kinds of messages and you suspect that maybe the messages you're seeing aren't from your boss, but they're spurious messages developed by your adversaries, how do you tell the good messages from the bad without blowing your cover in the country? What you've got to do is look for properties that only your source would know about, or clues that he would take advantage of stuff that your adversaries don't know about. Well, let's take a look at what's called the heptadic structure of Scripture. Imagine, you all have notepads there. Imagine, you can do this, I won't do this literally, but I want you to imagine me giving you an assignment. I would like you to draft, from fiction, doesn't have to be a real one, a genealogy. How many could, with a scrap of paper, draft an imaginary genealogy of a family? How many could do that? Well, you could. Sure, everybody could. Okay, but I'm going to give you a few rules. First of all, I would like, when you're through, the number of words that you end up with to be a multiple of 7 exactly. What I mean by that is, if you count up the words you've used, divide by 7, there's no remainder. So either it's 7 or 14 or 21, 20, and so on. You get the idea. How many can still do that? You could sure fudge that, couldn't you? Okay. Except I got another rule I'd like to add. I like the number of letters that you end up using to also be divisible by 7 exactly. Well, now that's a little trickier. You see, if the results of what you're doing are random, you've got 6 chances of losing and 1 of winning. Every rule of 7 like this, there's 6 cases that won't fit, there's only 1 that does. If you got 2 rules, you now have 7 squared. You got 48 chances of missing and 1 of winning. You follow what I'm saying? Okay, well, if I want the number of vowels and number of consonants also to be divisible by 7. But I'm not through yet. I'd like the number of words that begin with a vowel to be divisible by 7 exactly. I'd like the number of words that begin with a consonant to be divisible by 7. I'd like the number of words that occur more than once to be divisible by 7, and those that occur in more than one form divisible by 7, and occur only in one form divisible by 7. In each case, of course, when I say divisible by 7, it means 7 with no remainder. I'm still not through. I want the number of nouns that shall be divisible by 7. Only 7 words will not be nouns, and the number of names shall be divisible by 7. How many are still playing? I've discouraged you, I think, haven't I? Well, only 7 other kinds of nouns be permitted. The number of male names divisible by 7, the number of generations. And what you probably guessed is what I'm describing here are the first 11 verses of the Gospel of Matthew, which is the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And it's in Greek, not English. In English, you can fudge a little bit. It's softer. You can play games. In Greek, every verb has to fit 5 conditions. It's a very rigid, tight, probably the most precise language on the planet Earth in terms of mathematical precision. So playing these games is tough in Greek. But this is the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And you get the idea here that this was designed. This wasn't accidental. Now, I'm showing you the discoveries of Dr. Ivan Panin. He's born in Russia in 1855. He got tangled up with a plot against the Tsar, so he was exiled at an early age, emigrated to Germany, and then to the United States. He graduated from Harvard in 1882, and he discovered Christ. Now, every one of us in this room that has discovered the Lord Jesus Christ is the result of a miracle. Now, if you're a PhD from Harvard and you discover Christ, that's a miracle indeed, okay? But he discovered Christ, and he also discovered shortly thereafter the heptadic structure of the Scriptures, this heptadic or sevenfold structure of the Scriptures. And he committed the rest of his life, some 50 years, generating over 43,000 pages of discoveries, written in very small print and hand. Did this all manually, of course. And he went to the Lord on October 30th of 42. But one of the things I want to share with you, in your Bible, you have, of course, the Gospel of Mark. If you look at the 16th chapter of Mark, the last chapter of Mark, you'll notice that there's probably a footnote that suggests the possibility that the last 12 verses really weren't there originally, that they were added later. How many, it gives me a feeling, how many have a footnote to that rough effect? Okay, that's over half of you. Okay. Well, the reason that's there is because there are a couple of texts that are from Alexandria, the Alexandrian codices. They happen to be the oldest complete texts, and they 3rd, 4th century kind of texts. And some people regard them because it would seem to be the oldest, that they're most authoritative. That's one possibility. It might be that these verses were added later, or these verses may have been expurgated in that text. And there are ways to get at this. Were these really added later, or were they expurgated? Alexandria was the hotbed of the Gnostics. I might point out to you that these codices are 4th century, and yet these verses are quoted in the 2nd century by Irenaeus, Hippolytus, and this is several hundred years before the Alexandrian codices. So I can shred the idea that these verses were added later from history. But I want to set that aside and show you something else that I think is interesting. There is a security system that has been working for you for more than 1,000 years. Hasn't rusted, won't wear out. Let me show you how it works. The last 12 verses of Mark are a subject of focus. How many words are involved in the Greek? We're using the Westcott and Hort text here. There are 175 words involved in the Greek. By the way, that's a multiple of 7 exactly. 7 times 25. Well, that's curious. The vocabulary in those last 12 verses involved 98 words. That's a multiple of 7 exactly. The letters in the last 12 verses of Mark are 553. That's a multiple of 7 exactly. Are you getting the feeling here something's going on? Now, the number of vowels are 294. That's a multiple of 7 exactly. The consonants, 259. That's a multiple of 7 exactly. Let's go back to this vocabulary. The vocabulary, I said, was 98 words. 84 of those are found earlier in Mark. That's a multiple of 7 exactly. Those that are used only here are a multiple of 7 exactly. Those that are used in the Lord's address, which is a portion of that 12 verses, is 42. That's a multiple of 7 exactly. There are 56 that are not part of his normal vocabulary. Now, what I've given you here are some rules. Now, if I give you a rule, one of these constraints, as a mathematician would call it, For every one of those, there's 6, if it's random, if this is a random process, there are 6 chances of losing and 1 of winning. If I have 2 rules, that's 7 times 7, so I have 1 chance in 49 of getting it right. The rest would be, losers, so to speak. If I have 3 rules, that's 7 cubed. So there's 1 chance in 343 of that feature being there as a result of random chance. Do you follow what I'm saying? The more unlikely it is to be a process of random chance, the more it argues that it's there deliberately somehow. And if I have 4 of these rules, that's 7 to the 4th. So if I have 4 rules, there's 1 chance in 2,401 of this being by random chance. Well, I've given you 9 rules so far. And applying this logic, that would imply that there's 1 chance in 40 million that this characteristic we're observing is by accident. It obviously is deliberate. Now, would you like to try this? Let's assume you say, gee, I'd like to try this. We won't put Greek on you, do it in English. We'll let you work 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, give you 2 weeks off for vacation. That's 2,000 man-hours a year, person-hours a year, excuse me, girls. And that in 10 minutes, that's 120,000 minutes per year. You've got to try, apparently, about 7 to the 9th chances, or 40 million attempts. Well, if you can do an average of 1 draft of those 12 verses once in every 10 minutes, you can knock this off in about 3,362 years. Anyone want to try? It gets worse. These are the last 12 verses of Mark, and I won't go through it in detail except to point out that the first 2 verses are the appearance to Mary. Then there's a chunk of verses from 11 to 18, 7 verses that are subsequent appearances, and then there's 2 verses that wrap up the whole gospel. So that's the way it's organized. Another way of cutting it would be the first 5 verses are simple narrative. Then the next 4 verses are Christ's discourse, and then, of course, the last 2 verses concluding it. With that in mind, I mentioned there's 175 words, multiple of 7 exactly. There are 56 words in the address of the Lord, that's a multiple of 7. The rest of the passage is 119, a multiple of 7. Verses 9 to 11, which is a chunk of that, is a multiple of 7. And I won't go through each one. Each one of these natural divisions of the narrative involve a number of words that are multiple of 7 precisely. But it goes on. Greek, like the Hebrew, also has numerical values for each of the letters. That means that any word has a numerical value as well as the letters. And this is called gematria. If you take the 12 verses of Mark and add up the numerical value of all the letters involved, that number also ends up being a multiple of 7 exactly. Strange. That's tough to simulate, by the way. And again, if I take these verse divisions, we find the geometrical value is also, the first word, last word, so forth, are all multiples of 7 exactly. I talked about vocabulary, 98 words, which is multiple of 7, not before in Mark, found later in the New Testament. They occur 35 times, multiple of 7. Their numerical value is also a multiple of 7, and so on. It goes on like this. And I'll spare you the long version, except just to highlight a couple of interesting ones here. There is a word for deadly in the Greek that's not found elsewhere in the New Testament, only here in the New Testament. It has a numerical value of 581. That's a multiple of 7 exactly. It's preceded in the vocabulary by a multiple of 7 exactly and follows. Well, I've given you 34 rules or characteristics or constraints. And that turns out to be a very, very big number. Very big number. It turns out that you need about 5 times 10 to the 28th tries if you did this by just brute force or trying it in a straightforward fashion. There are about 3 times 10 to the 7th seconds in a year. Now, to try this in your excuse me, in your imagination, you're going to try and do this yourself. I will give you a computer. I'm going to give you a supercomputer that will do 400 million tries per second. Every second it'll do a complete draft and test it against these rules. It'll do 400 million of those per second. Well, at 4 times 10 to the 8th tries per second, that would take about 4.3 million computer years. In other words, if I gave you 1 million supercomputers, it would take you 4.3 million years to pull this off. Anyone want to try? Well, let me rephrase the question. Does anyone think that some scribe did this by hand? I don't think so. And I only gave you 34 rules. Dr. Panin has identified 75 for this passage. So I think that's kind of fun. See, this is one of the reasons we recognize there's a comprehensive design. Let me give you another one. The New Testament consists of 27 books, right? Each book has a first word and a last word. If you take the terminating words of each of the books of the New Testament, there's 27 books times 2, first and last, you get 54 words. The total vocabulary of these words is 28 different words. That's a multiple of 7 exactly. Really? I wonder how that was engineered. Did all the writers conspire to design their manuscripts to meet this? I don't think so. The Gospels alone are a multiple of 7. The total geometrical value, again, is a multiple of 7 exactly. The value of the shortest word in the New Testament is 1 letter, has a value of 70. It's a multiple of 7 exactly. Here's the one I like best. The value of the longest word in the New Testament is apocalypsis, and it is a multiple of 7 exactly. In fact, it's 7 times 6 times 6 times 6. I think that's kind of fun. But here's the one that's the coup de grace for me. Buried in pen and stuff, I happened to stumble into it. The vocabulary that's unique to Matthew is a multiple of 7. Is vocabulary that occurs at 42 words, multiple of 7 exactly, with 126 letters, multiple of 7 exactly. Now, the only thing that this vocabulary has as its attribute is that they're words that are only used in Matthew, nowhere else in the New Testament. You follow me so far? Question: how was this organized? Let's assume that Matthew is trying to do this on purpose. How would he organize that this particular list of words, a multiple of 7 exactly, would not appear anywhere else in the New Testament? There's only 2 ways he could do that. One is by getting prior agreement with all the other writers of the books that would be ultimately absorbed in the canon. How many think that happened? Of course not. Well, the other way, you could use this as an argument that Matthew had to have written his gospel last. The theory being that he could lay out all the other books that have been written and find those words that only he uses and nudge that around so it's a multiple of 7 exactly. So I could use that as an argument that Matthew's gospel was written last. Gospel of Matthew is written last. The problem is, so is the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark has a vocabulary that's unique to Mark, that's not used anywhere else in the New Testament, and it's a multiple of 7 exactly. But so is the Gospel of Luke. It was written last. Whoops, so is the Gospel of John written last. See, the point is these things couldn't be organized if they wanted to. And by the way, so is James, Peter, Jude, and Paul. Each one was written last. They each have a vocabulary unique to them that is a multiple of 7 exactly. And by the way, these words that are unique bridge the Old and New Testament. The word hallelujah appears 24 times in the Old Testament, 4 times in the New. That's 28 altogether, a multiple of 7 exactly. The word Hosanna is once in the Old Testament, 6 times in the New. Again, it's a multiple of 7. All these words, Jehovah, Sabaoth, Corban, there's a number of words that are used a multiple of 7 exactly if you stitch the Old and New Testament together. I think that's kind of fun. I promise you, though, that we would focus on the ultimate code. In a coding sense, it's the ultimate code. And the ultimate code, of course, is guess who? You. Do you read? What library, the books in this library are read more often than any other library in the world? The answer is your DNA. You have a master record, and it is unraveled, copied, and rolled up in ways that defy one's imagination. But I won't get into too much of that because that's peripheral to our main interest here. The elements of language include semantics, the position of things. Remember Paul Revere's ride, one if by land, two if by sea. It also has a syntax. The lantern had to be in a particular place. In this case, in the famous poem, it had to be in the Old North Church. See, the most advanced computers could not have broken Paul Revere's code. Why? Because it was a code, not a cipher. It was just arbitrary, but still it had semantics. And so there are very simplex alphabets. We've talked about those. But it may surprise you to discover there are codes that are error detecting. When you send a byte in a computer, you have an extra bit or so that's called a parity bit, which is always either odd or even, so they can tell if you've dropped a bit in transmission. It's a way of catching mistakes. If you want to add not 1 bit, but 3 bits to that byte, you can make it error correcting. You can make the 3 bits determine the position of the error, and if it's binary, you can obviously reverse it. So there are codes that are error detecting and they're error correcting. The FSU-27, I remember, was a strange machine. You could take a card and pull it out while it was running, and it would continue going because the logic and the thing was designed around error-correcting coding. Yes, you had 11 bits per byte, not 7, but when you're dealing with ultra-reliability, it's worth the payoff in some cases. So there are also codes that will modify themselves. They're adaptive coding. They'll adapt to syntax and so forth. I'm not here to explore those codes except to point out one of the most advanced codes known to man is in our DNA. What people overlook about your DNA is a 3 out of 4 error-correcting, self-replicating code. And there's probably not one engineer in 1,000 that would know how to even go about designing one of those. And yet, of course, we're taught that it all happened by chance. You and I are just random results of randomness. You know, it's amazing. We found the most insulting God to invent. You know, the ancient pagans they attributed their creation to gods of stone or iron or wood, whatever. We've found a more insulting God of all. We attribute it all to randomness. God wasn't even necessary. God is offended by not being worshipped or putting our worship to these false gods. But what's even more insulting is to deny that one is even necessary. But anyway, in the DNA code, we have over 3 billion elements defining the manufacture and the arrangement of hundreds of thousands of devices. I used to be a senior executive at Ford Motor Company, and one of our proud facilities in the United States was the River Rouge plant. It has 97 miles of railroad in it. Raw limestone, raw ore comes in one end. They make their own glass, their own paint, their own steel, as well as cars. New cars come out the other end. It's the largest integrated manufacturing facility in the world. It's worth the tour if you're in the region. Your simplest cell is more complex than the River Rouge plant. The simplest cell is an entire city with garbage disposal facilities, manufacturing plants, input-output controls, gates, gatemen. It's astonishing, the complexity of the simple cell. But anyway, the DNA code consists of unique assemblies. They selected from over 200 proteins, each involving over 3,000 atoms in 3-dimensional configurations. And it's all defined from an initial alphabet of 20 amino acids. And those 20 amino acids are defined by, in effect, 4 codes. The genetic code, where it's so much in the news, I'm just going to highlight a few aspects of this that you may not be sensitive to from a coding point of view. In your cell, there is your DNA. That is your master record, your master blueprint. To conduct all the things that are going on, they don't endanger that. They make a copy of it for the workers. There's a transcription that makes the RNA, which you can look at like a photocopy of the master blueprint. And then that RNA is translated to create the proteins, which are in effect functional machines. And the Crick dogma, of course, was that you go from the DNA through the RNA, you go downhill. The shocking discovery is that there are retroviruses that will actually not only create disease, it'll go back and alter your master record. And that's a whole other thing. But I wanted to mention something about the DNA being transcribed. The DNA, before it's made in the RNA, something interesting happens, that there are sections of it that are selected out, and what's remained is spliced together. The introns are pulled out, the exons are spliced together. The point I'm making, with your background from yesterday, you realize these are equidistant letter sequences. This is a form of encryption that we find in the Bible, and you find in your DNA. And of course, it's a 3 out of 4 error correcting code. The DNA has a certain chemistry. These have intrinsic chemical affinity towards one another. So where you have one, you have its mate. And this kind of coding scheme allows you to split it, and it will find its mates. It's an intrinsically self-replicating code. It'll copy itself without error. And that itself is an interesting design feature. It's intrinsically self-replicating. What's interesting about the coding structure, these 3 out of 4 codes will specify any of the 20 amino acids you're going to need for the proteins, plus leave some over for punctuation. You have start controls, stop controls, that kind of thing. So you have an alphabet designed here that is operative. And your messenger RNA, of course, needs to be translated into proteins. So there are machines that emerge out of all of this that will transfer the RNA. And what it does, it will read that code and decode it. And as it moves along, it knows from the coding what protein it's talking about, and it strings those along to create a protein chain. And that protein chain has characteristics that will cause it to form a three-dimensional machine. And the actual chemical equations are not critical here, except to notice that they're unified in terms of the way they connect to one another. And there are 20 amino acids that make up all of life. These 20 amino acids, half of them are non-soluble, the other half are soluble. Some of these are acidic, some are basic. But because of these characteristics, being polar or nonpolar, they will, when put in a chain, adopt a unique three-dimensional configuration to become the machine that is required. And so this is all the negatively groups charged with the positive and the hydrophobic are some attack in the center, some outside. I won't get that here, other than to say the final stable 3D shape is the minimum energy configuration that's dictated by the specific sequence that the DNA has specified. So you go from these complex specifications into a error-correcting mechanism to produce several 100,000 different types of machines and other functions. Well, just to review, remember we talked with the beads the other day, and we talked about could these beads have happened by random, and you quickly rejected the idea that 347 beads with only an alphabet of 2 could be assembled in Genesis 1:1 in Morse code. That was obviously absurd. That was a probability of simply call it 3 times 10 with 104 zeros. Even that instinctively you knew was impossible, because anything with over 50 zeros was defined as absurd just by way of reviews. Well, we were talking about a binary string of 347. We're going to talk about a hemoglobin molecule. That has 574 elements selected from an alphabet of 20. And hemoglobin is 574 amino acids long, and here's the composite of them. There's elements of all these different amino acids in a specific sequence, and if you don't have that sequence, you have hemoglobinopathy. It's fatal. The formula for the linear arrangements is a factorial thing. Anyway, it's 10 to the 600 with 650 zeros. Just one of them is hemoglobin. The others are hemoglobinopathy. So did this happen by chance? Hardly. This is vastly more absurd than the little bead thing I did yesterday. Impossible. By the way, it's only 18 seconds in the history of the universe. See, these are big numbers. 10 to the 66 atoms, 80 particles, 10 to the 80 particles, and so forth. So the specificity of hemoglobin is far beyond chance. 10 to the 50 defines absurd, 10 to the 650th is far beyond chance. It's equal, by the way, to give you a feeling for this, it's equal to winning the lottery in the United States, not 2 days in a row, every day for 90 days in a row. That's another way to get across the unlikelihood of it all. There's another concept that you want to be aware of, that if you really, there are 3 guys that in my mind have totally shredded the whole idea of evolution, the evolutionary hypothesis. Michael Denton, the Australian, in 1986, his book Evolution, a Theory and Crisis. He's not a Christian awareness, he's just a scientist, but he points out all the problems that modern science, that evolution is no longer viable for modern science. But Michael Behe, Philip Johnson, William Dembski, 3 different guys writing 3 different books in recent years, have absolutely rendered evolution to an illogical position. You're not familiar with these books, you may want to. Philip Johnson wrote Darwin on Trial, should be in every thinking person's library. Michael Behe wrote Darwin's Black Box. William Dembski, a little more sophisticated writer in some respects, but The Design Inference. These are 3 books that are not Christian books, don't misunderstand me, but they clearly highlight the absolute absurdity of the evolutionary hypothesis. Michael Behe highlights a concept which he calls irreducible complexity. And it's a very interesting concept. Every engineer here will pick up on it right away. There is a point of complexity that you can't get below. Let's take a mousetrap. A mousetrap consists of 5 things. A platform. It has a hammer, you might call it, a spring to drive that hammer, a holding bar to hold it back, and a catch to hold the holding bar. If you have those 5 elements, you've got a mousetrap that'll catch mice. If you have only 4 of the 5 elements, you don't catch 4/5 as many mice. You catch 0. See, there's a point at which you can't simplify this and have it still function. People have tried to make a better mousetrap. Try it. It's survived all these years. It's an example of irreducible complexity. There's certain things that can't evolve because it takes a certain level of complexity before they're even functional. And let's take the bacteria with a flagellum. You've probably seen them under microscopes in school. Flagellum has a little tail that propels it through the fluid. If you examine that, there's a place where that little tail, the flagellum, enters the bacteria. And we're going to look at just the place where it enters, and we discover something very interesting. There is what's the equivalent of an electric motor with slip rings, all kinds of over 40 parts, any one of which is missing, it doesn't work. And so this is not something that could have happened. It's something that was very skillfully designed. Anybody that's ever been on a design team knows that designs don't happen. They have to be crafted. And I won't get into more of this. That's the basic. See, the real question, the reason the evolutionists can't explain life, it's not they can't explain which came first, the DNA or the proteins. You can't have proteins without the DNA. You can't have the DNA without proteins. It's even deeper than the chicken and egg classic one. It takes protein to construct the DNA. It takes DNA to make the protein. See, they both had to be created at the same time in a consistent system architecture. Which came first, the DVD or the DVD players? They have to come together to create a function that's useful. If you have DVDs without a DVD player or vice versa, you're dead in the water. Same sort of concept. Every engineer would know that. The whole concept of evolution is absurd. And by the way, thoughts in language are conceptual, not physical in the first place. And so we've gone through some of these. Let me just hit one last thought that you might find provocative. The technology of the resurrection. We've talked about coding, information sciences. People often ask, do you guys believe in the resurrection? What happens to the guy that's been eaten by a cannibal? How does he get resurrected? Or what about the bodies that are at sea that get totally decomposed? Or, they have all these problems with what's the technology of the resurrection? See, what everybody overlooks is the whole issue of resurrection is not an issue of biology. It's an issue of information. See, all atoms are fungible material. If you have a hydrocarbon chemistry, you've got carbon atoms, hydrogen atoms, whatever. We have a hydrocarbon kind of chemistry. Carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms are fungible building blocks. Getting the atoms to put together molecules ain't the problem. The problem is the design. All that is required for you to be resurrected is information. All God needs is your DNA and maybe a little bit more. And this is dramatized in a piece of fiction recently called Jurassic Park. Michael Crichton took some technology and made a very entertaining novel out of it, made into several movies actually. But the basic idea was very simple. By capturing the DNA of a dinosaur from a mosquito that's been captured in amber, the idea was you get the DNA, and from that DNA you could replicate the creature. And that was what led, of course, to the plot. But with the underlying technology, there's very, very provocative. All you needed to recreate those creatures, it would seem, at least in concept, is the DNA of the original creature. And so that puts a whole different complexion on this. And Frank Tipler wrote a book, The Physics of Immortality. And he was an unbeliever, but he decided to try to pull together everything that he's a cosmologist and also particle physicist, very sophisticated mind. And he wanted to take everything we think we know about the Big Bang and the beginning of cosmology, as is commonly rendered, and everything we think we know about the ultimate heat death of the universe. Not only is there a mystery of how it began, there's also a mystery how it's going to end, presumably, because everybody knows it's winding down. There's an ultimate time when temperatures are uniform and there's no more work can be done. So we're in this parenthesis. And so he wanted to try to tie all this together in a composite theory. And as he pursued that project, he came to some real shocking conclusions. Just from the laws of physics, as they're understood, he came to the conclusion that God exists. Now, you may laugh and say, gee, good luck to Tracy. I mean, what's new? No, to understand where he was coming from. But the second conclusion he came to was rather provocative. He came to the conclusion that all life was destined for resurrection. And he did that from the laws of physics, in effect. And that's very, very interesting. See, many people don't realize that all people are destined for resurrection. You see, my real problem in this conference, not just because of the lighting, is that I can't see you. I can only see your temporary residences. Now, I have a computer up here. If you knew everything there is to know about this hardware, every circuit, every microchip, every element of the hardware, could you tell me anything about its behavior? Not really, because that hardware is simply the residence of software that's running. The software can be in a diskette, of course. Now, if I take that diskette, a blank diskette, and put it on a postal scale, it weighs about 7/10 of an ounce. If I spend hundreds of dollars, hundreds of pounds, and load that diskette with over 1 million bytes of software, what will it weigh? 7/10 of an ounce. See, software has no mass. In fact, we can even, it's like a light switch. It's on or off. It doesn't change the weight of the switch. It's just positional information. Same thing with the software that's on the diskette. And so, in fact, I can send that software through the airwaves. It has no mass, which means if it has no mass, it has no time. Now, the real you, I can't see. I can only see the temporary residence you're in. Now, some of our residences have a little too much mass. That's a whole different thing. But the real you, I can see. The real you is software, not hardware. Call it soul, spirit, give it what vocabulary you like. The real you is software, not hardware. The real you has no time dimension. The real you is eternal, whether you like it or not. The dilemma is, where are you going to spend it? Are you going to spend it in the presence of God? Are you qualified to be perfect, to be in His presence? Or will you be denied His presence? You see, you're in this little parenthesis that some people call a boot camp for eternity. And so this time we spent exploring the coding and the information sciences, I hope, was well spent. I hope you find that provocative.